So I think I'll start off by telling, I know this is probably redundant, but I think I'll start off by telling an embarrassing story. So part of why I've been interested in this topic for a long time and kind of worried about categorization for a long time as a method of in social ontology and metaphysics. And part of what precipitated some of my recent attention to it is that I got a referee proposal. I was asked to referee a paper, and I saw the title, and the title was "Groups as Pluralities," and I got very cranky, and I was like, I'm not going to referee yet another paper on groups as something else. And so I sent the editor an email, and I was like, I'm sorry, I'm done refereeing papers on groups that are, on how to classify groups. And I was talking to a good friend of mine. I can give you his name, Dan Lopez de Sa, and I told him that I had just crankily rejected to referee this paper. And he said, actually, I'm the co-author of that paper. I, of course, was really embarrassed. It turns out it's a wonderful paper, of course, because Dan is excellent. Well, I don't have a real end to the story, except that was a ridiculous thing to do, except that it did make me start to like try to justify to him initially, like what the worries are that I have about about thinking about categorizing social entities or categories of social entities in other categories. Categorization, I think, is something that we do a lot in social ontology, and it's something that we do in metaphysics in general, but I think in social ontology, certainly in some subfields, there's a ton of categorization. What I have in mind is, in some literatures, there's a lot of explicit categorization, like people categorizing, well, I mentioned groups, and I'm going to be talking a lot about groups in today's paper, but people also try to explain kind of the nature of corporations by talking about what corporations are. Corporations are nexuses of contracts. Corporations are bundles of resources. Corporations are sets of people. Corporations are, this or that. There's a big new literature on the law. Law is an artifact. Law is a set of rules, and so on. There is a huge literature in the ontology of music on what musical works are. Some people think they're Platonic types. Some people think that they're have sets or collections of things or historical individuals. And there's also a big literature on words. And I'm going to be talking about that as well. So there's a lot of, and I think this is just a very widely, kind of a widely discussed or widely used methodology for trying to approach the metaphysics of various kinds of entities. I think it's also done a lot implicitly in literatures, even where it's not explicit. So somebody like Ron Mallon, working on homeostatic property cluster kinds as a theory of race, I think also kind of has this kind of classification claim for large swaths of social kinds. For instance, Asta might be doing the same kind of thing in classifying many social kinds as conferred. And I guess I think that there are a lot of reasons for concern with this. I think that the claims are not as clear as they might seem. I think that they often kind of illicitly focus on a fragment of the entities in the domain, as opposed to really thinking about domains as a whole. I find some of the arguments for classification questionable. I also think that even if they worked, that they would show less. We would learn less from these classifications than they're assumed to show us. I also think that the motivations for them are often suspect. I think that the reasons people are trying to classify things are not necessarily good reasons. And I think they distract from more fruitful explanatory strategies. Other than that, I think they're fine. But but I think there are lots of worries that I have about them. I don't think that it's an empty or a misguided project, but I think it needs a lot more clarity than we currently are bringing to the table in thinking about these projects. So part of my aim is to try to kind of critique or defamiliarize something that we do a lot. I've done it a lot in the past, kind of thinking about answers to ontological questions as being categorization questions. And I think that's something that we ought to think about. And in particular, we ought to try to consider some other methods that we might use instead. So other methods for what? Well, I think that what we're really trying to do is to come up with answers, at least kinds of answers to questions of the form, what is X? Like what are groups, what is law, etc. I think that a lot of the categorization literature aims to answer or partly answer those questions with claims like groups are pluralities, or groups are fusions, or groups are realizations of structures, or these kinds of answers. So I take it to be this to be a kind of central task that people in social ontology work on. I think it's a little controversial, kind of what our tasks are altogether in social ontology. I think that part of what this task is doing is trying to be descriptive. It's to do a kind of descriptive metaphysics. And I also don't think that it captures all of what we do in social ontology, certainly. But I think that still answering these what are X questions is something that's very central to what we're trying to accomplish in social ontology. And so I think it's relevant to see if these kinds of categorization style answers are helpful or not for answering what are X sorts of questions. Okay. Okay. So my plan today is I think the build isn't working properly here, but my plan today is to work to present some approaches to categorization in the literature. I want to talk kind of about some specifics about people who worked on categorization of groups and people who worked on the categorization of words. There are other ones that are relevant for the inquiry, like music, law, assertion, and so on. I think it's important to consider several domains. One of the things that I think is crucial is that there's a kind of balkanization, I think, of work in social ontology and in these kinds of categorization projects, which I think is a problem. So people who are working on groups are not talking to the people who are working on words or working on music. There's a little bit of overlap, but I think that actually there's a lot of cross-fertilization that ought to take place. And we can actually see some of the shortcomings of the projects by doing this cross-fertilization. So what I want to do here is try to systematize some of the aspects of approaches people are taking. In doing so, to bring out some shortcomings. And then if I have some time to talk a little bit about other approaches, I think that there's other evidence that we can deploy that a lot of the current work in answering these sorts of what are X questions regard as peripheral, but that I think is not peripheral, that I think it's actually quite central. Things like exploring the metaphysical sources of categories. And I also think that we need to be open to extremely heterogeneous categories that don't necessarily fit the kinds of categorizations that we tend to see people gravitating towards in the literature. Okay, so the cases that I'll discuss are groups. And one of the things that's important is to think about what people in each one of these categories is targeting in the bulk of the literature on categorization. So when people talk about what are groups and they talk about the theories about kind of how groups ought to be understood in a broader ontological category, they're kind of categorizing a category of instances of like particular groups. That's in contrast to people when they're talking about words. There's a big literature that I'll talk about also on the nature of words, where also people will talk about, well, what kind of a kind is word? But words are, I mean, very roughly speaking, at least, they're things that are instantiable. That is, a word is something that can have tokens, whereas you don't think of a group as something that can have tokens. A group can have members, but you think of groups as particulars. So there's actually a kind of interesting difference between the kind of thing that people are trying to categorize when they're trying to answer what are groups questions and what are words questions, even though some of the answers end up being kind of similar to one another. I won't have time today to talk about musical works. Most of the literature there is talking about categorizing what a musical work is, which is very much like what a word is. But then there's this other sub-literature on what an authentic performance is, and that's a very kind of confusing literature as well. It's confusing partly because it kind of mixes up what counts as a performance, or what a performance is, and what an authentic performance is. So, you know, or there's a kind of degree question there. So that's a kind of complicated literature that I think is relevant as well. So there's some overlaps between these different literatures and the way that they attempt to classify the entities that they're targeting. And I think there are various reasons that they overlap, and there are also important differences between them. So one of the things that I think is problematic in the kind of balkanization of this literature, that you have these people working on kind of one approach to one target domain, pretty much to the exclusion of others, is that I think that that it doesn't, that we kind of lose focus on what kinds of entities are available to be targeting inside of these domains. There's a kind of accidental history, in a way, that the literature on the nature of words tends to be a literature on what categories word types ought to fall into, as opposed to word tokens ought to fall into. And that's different for how groups work. People never work on the nature of group kinds. They always work on the nature of groups. And I think that that's a bit puzzling, actually. So how do people do this? Well, what they do is that they tend to have categories that they propose, and then they debate features or desiderata of the entities that they're trying to target. So to get specific about kind of different sorts of ways that people categorize groups, these are different theories of social groups. There's a lot of them. So one large group of people argues that groups are pluralities. And you know, this goes back, you can see that a lot of these are going back to the 70s or to the 50s. There's been a long history of people trying to do this. So you have people who are arguing that groups are pluralities, people who argue that groups are fusions of one sort or another, some even in the audience today, I guess. There are hylomorphic accounts of groups. There's an account that Kate Ritchie has done a lot of work on, but that also has some historical background as well, where groups are structures or realizations of structures. There are other people who are kind of want to put it in a different sort of kind, or who kind of refuse to put it into a kind category at all. And then there are other people who think that they're mathematical entities. So these are sort of the proposed kind of categories into which groups are, the classifications into which groups are put. The arguments that people give for these sorts of categories tend to draw on claimed features of groups. So they say, well, groups have these characteristics. These then are the desiderata for a theory of groups. There's some back and forth often between the desiderata and the categorization, maybe some sort of reflective equilibrium where they say, well, actually this desiderata isn't a desideratum because I favor pluralities, but pluralities don't have this characteristic. And then there are other considerations. I think these are very prominent in the early work where people were very much favored ontological parsimony. And so the most parsimonious category that one could put these into was taken to be the correct one. So people were trying to minimize ontological commitment and draw on familiar categories. Often one gets the sense that a theorist kind of has a favorite category that they then try to apply to a variety of different kinds. Maybe it's artifacts or abstract artifacts or whatever else. And then they so these are the kinds of arguments that they give for these categorizations. Now, when you look at the literature as a whole, you can kind of tabulate these the desiderata or the features of groups that people will propose, and that they then try to put forward as things that either their proposal satisfies, or else, if their proposal doesn't satisfy it, then they argue that it's not actually a feature or a desideratum of the category for some reason or another. So I kind of have to apologize for the next slide because it's not going to be super legible because it's kind of a mess. I've put in a lot of, I'm trying to kind of to just list or tabulate lots and lots of desiderata. And I found that as I've done so, I didn't quite understand what the desiderata were. And so I then kind of put them in logic as much as I could. So here are some characteristics that people have put forward for groups. And as you can see, this is why I'm apologizing, because there's a lot of logic and it's in very small type. But here's some features that people have proposed for groups. Now, let me just say a word about how I'm formulating these constraints or features. So when I write instances for these kinds of constraints or properties, you can read that in this case as groups. So that is to say, groups can exist at some but not all worlds. Some people think, for instance, that groups are modally flexible, so that they might exist in one world and not exist in another world. That seems very plausible. Another one, groups can exist at some but not all times. That also seems plausible. And it's compatible with some theories of groups, and it's incompatible with other theories of groups. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to write them as constraints that could apply to other kinds of categories, because what we're going to be doing is we're going to be trying to find other categories that also satisfy these constraints. So when I say instances, what I mean is that this is a kind of second order statement. That is to say that if you're looking for a category that satisfies this feature that has this constraint, well, we say that groups satisfy this constraint. Now, what we're looking for is other categories that also satisfy this constraint. Do sets satisfy this constraint? Do fusions satisfy it? Do pluralities satisfy it? Do do structured realizations of structures satisfy it? Does that make sense? So the idea is that all of these constraints are these kinds of second order properties of categories, or they're properties of categories. That is, they're second order properties. And I'm kind of using categories, properties, and kinds sort of interchangeably here. I don't think that's actually a problem. And these these are going to be the desiderata for a theory that is of a category into which groups fall, or with which groups should be identified. So I'm just going to kind of go, so as not to use a ton of time, I don't want to go through or explain every single one of these desiderata, but there's a variety of them. Some of them are a little hard to state precisely, but there are desiderata involving things like, well, groups can change their members. or groups can be, I think that one thing that we might consider is that I think groups could be empty at some time. It's possible that groups can be empty all the time. So that might be a desideratum on a kind of thing that groups might be. Another thing that's widely discussed is that distinct instances of groups can coincide. So you might think that, for instance, I mean, Margaret Gilbert has argued that, you know, the what is it, the sewing committee and the phone committee or something like that can have the same members and yet be distinct committees. And I've argued elsewhere that they can actually necessarily coincide. So some of the cases that I've put forward, like in my book and in some other stuff, has been that you can have these distinct instances of groups that are distinct and yet that necessarily have the same members. So those could be divided into more properties as well. Then there's some other desiderata about groups of groups. You might think that there can be groups of groups. There's issues having to do with the transitivity of membership, so that if I'm a member of a group and a group is a member of another group, then I'm not necessarily a member of the bigger group, and so on. And then there might be more desiderata as well. So we could put together a table like this, where what we have is a list of the desiderata on the left side, and we have all of the different theories up on the top. And then we say which ones satisfy the desiderata and which ones don't. And where they don't, that either, some people will take that as a reason for rejecting that theory. You might think, well, that means the fact that that, for instance, there's a problem with the transitivity characteristics of fusions, so that with a fusion of people, you know, my hand is a member of the group. You might think that that is, you know, I mean, or you know, say, you know, whatever, Ketanji Jackson's hand is a member of the Supreme Court or something like that. That's a transitivity problem having to do with fusions. And you might think that that rules out the idea that groups can be fusions. But on the other hand, obviously the people who are advocating that are going to have counterexamples. They're either going to say, no, actually it does satisfy that desideratum for whatever reason, or that desideratum isn't a reasonable desideratum. Okay, there's too much here for me to go through right now, but what I want to do is kind of just consider a few of the desiderata, just to show you some structure about what we're trying to do, I think, in trying to come up with a sort of categorization. So, you know, we have, so some of the characteristics that I listed up above, like, you know, there can be instances that coincide, there can be instances that change members. Those seem like they're problems for pluralities, but they're not necessarily problems for other theories of groups. So we get these kinds of you know, ways in which the desiderata may or may not be filled. One way of thinking about this is kind of like as a feature matrix like this, where you have kind of pluses or minuses for each one of the proposals. And then I guess ideally you would have one with all pluses. But I mean, I think that it's a little, it's helpful. And one of the things I've been kind of trying to depict is to think about this sort of as more of a Venn diagram. And this is a bad Venn diagram, not just because, well, I did it in the skewed way so that I'd have the space on the next slides to show what I need to. But it also doesn't really, you can't have a Venn diagram with so many different circles. You need multiple dimensions and whatever, and I don't know. But the idea, I think, is that we have these different kind of these kinds of features that we can kind of parcel out property space as either having or not. And then we have the kind of feature diagram can be depicted as sort of places inside of this Venn diagram. So it may be, for instance, that, you know, sets are good in the sense that they can have instances that are possibly empty, if that's what you want from a theory of groups, but they don't have, there's a problem with coincidence. You don't have distinct sets that have the same members, they're the same elements. Sets don't change over time. Sets can't possibly have different members, so they're not going to fall into any of these categories. So if you're a theorist who thinks that groups are sets, then you either have to modify what the kind of sets you're talking about, I guess, or you need to or you need to reject some of these desiderata. So one of the things I also just want to mention is this is very, very much a work in progress. And I think that some of the depictions that I'm putting up here, particularly with these diagrams, are not quite right. So, if you all have kind of helpful thoughts about that, that would be great. And then the question, though, that we want to ask is, well, where do the groups fall? If you're debating the desiderata, then you might think the groups might fall in any one of a number of these areas. If you think that it satisfies all of the desiderata and it has to, then it has to be in this middle region here, which kind of overlaps all the desiderata. So one of the things that I just want to observe is that that if you're considering the sorts of answers that people are giving in terms of, what are the eligible candidates for what categories things are going to fall into, there's a lot of space that's not occupied by any category. Also that just because you have some set of desiderata that's satisfied, you might have multiple different things that are going to satisfy those desiderata. So there's never going to be any argument that's going to help you decide that this one, that the hylomorphic answer, is different from the structural realization answer as your answer to what groups are, if they're both satisfying these desiderata. In fact, there's probably a plenitude of different categories inside of here. So it's not altogether clear what arguments one has deployed or could deploy once you've come up with a list of desiderata, especially ones that are not contentious, that are going to help you arbitrate between lots and lots of choices of categories. There's also lots more desiderata than the ones that are on this map. This is just a few of them, and as I showed a minute ago, there's dozens of different desiderata, at least candidate desiderata. So that makes the map very complicated, and in some ways it makes it, well, if you find an answer, then it makes it in some ways very challenging to fit the desiderata already. But it also makes it less likely, it seems to me, that there's going to be a familiar category that's going to kind of informatively give you an answer to why this satisfies the desiderata it does. Here's a way of another way of conceptualizing the task that this project of trying to come up with desiderata and then developing a theory of some other category that's going to satisfy those desiderata is going to generate. You might think, well, one issue, of course, that we're running into is that a lot of these features are going to be contested, but suppose that they weren't. Suppose that we came to agreement on what the desiderata were. You might think, well, together all these features generate a theory. You might kind of, in a David Lewis fashion, call it a realization formula, kind of in this Ramsey-Lewis formulation, where you have kind of a list of you want to say, well, these are all of the properties that I listed on that kind of map of features are these Ds, and then putting them all together, you come up with some realization formula. And what the theorists are claiming is, well, first of all, that groups satisfy all these desiderata. And then what they're doing is they're looking for another category. And maybe what they're doing is they're looking for another category C that satisfies those desiderata and also such that groups is a subcategory of C. That may be what they're trying to do. And it's not clear to me, if you solve that problem, what, in addition, you've learned about groups from answering that. Because we already had the realization formula, and we already claimed that groups satisfy these desiderata. So it's not clear what this categorization does for us. Now, maybe instead what we're doing is we're looking for a different category where it satisfies some subset of the desiderata. So it's a kind of superset category. And the question is, well, again, what have we learned from having done that? So, I mean, one way of thinking about this is, look, here's the kind of the Venn diagram I was showing before. And, you know, we have, let's say that groups are going to meet all of those desiderata in there, all of these overlapping things. And then we're looking for some other category, which is going to be one of these other sets of dotted lines. Now, the biggest category that's going to fit all the desiderata is going to be the kind of realization sentence I just listed. The larger categories are going to abstract from some desiderata, but presumably they have to kind of include that that subcategory. And the smallest category is groups itself. Now, plausibly, there's going to be like this dense set of nested subcategories in this kind of yellow or orange space here. Maybe there's some natural or familiar category between them. Surely there's going to be lots and lots of super categories here, but it's not clear what we're accomplishing in doing this categorization project. Okay, now all of that is even before we get to the point about the contestation of the desiderata. And it seems to me that kind of in the history of thinking about the nature of groups, and I actually think in thinking about lots of kind of literatures on categorization, there's these kind of different historical stages that we go through. One of them, we start with a sort of simple assumption, which tends to be very parsimonious. It's like, oh, well, you know, groups are just sets of people or something like that, or groups are pluralities. And then people start working out various desiderata and problems with that. They broaden their views. There's a proliferation and a debate about the features and about the categories. Some are of the form, my category can fit all of the desiderata. Some are of the form, your desiderata aren't the right desiderata, and so on. And we keep doing that over the years, and then the literature kind of fragments. There's a lot of contestation over which features are the relevant ones and which features a theory should have. And I think it's reasonable to contest this stuff. And this is actually part of answering, you know, what is groups question. But the question I want to ask is, should categories carry weight in modifying or having an impact on what features we should think that groups have? It may be that the category should carry weight if people are right to be extremely committed to a very parsimonious ontology. Maybe if you have a radically parsimonious ontology, then that allows you to be revisionary about all kinds of other sorts of metaphysical features. So in that sense, maybe it is justified to regard the categories as carrying weight. And maybe if you're not all that parsimonious, if you find one that's just like an amazing match between the desiderata that you have for your subcategory and of this other category, then that would be, except maybe there's a little problem, then maybe you can kind of wave away that little problem. So maybe there are reasons, but barring that, which I think is both of those, well, I'm not particularly tempted by ontological parsimony, and I guess that's just a bias. But so barring that, and then barring the idea, which I don't think we ever find, that there's like this perfect answer, it's hard to see why something like a respectable category, a category that's been discussed widely in the metaphysics literature, ought to carry much weight in kind of a reflective equilibrium where you are saying, well, I'm going to give up on this feature of sets because it doesn't match whatever categorization I'm proposing. Okay, I am cognizant of the time, and I know I started a little late, but I don't want to keep people extra late. So, so I think I might actually, I think to get in the next discussion that I wanted to talk about was about words. and I think that words do lead to a different kind of there's a very different sort um, of set of proposals. In a lot of ways, people talking about the nature of words. Let me just skip for 1 second to this one slide where I can kind of just list out the views of words so that you can see. Again, just as there's a big literature on kind of categorizing groups, there's also a big literature on categorizing words. And there's a lot of similarities between them. When you start writing out the kind of features or desiderata, you actually find that a lot of it maps to the same kinds of things that we're talking about in categorizing groups. Things like whether it's possible to have words that don't have tokens is something that is one of the things that gets debated. And that's basically formulated almost in parallel to the desideratum of whether there can be empty groups. So you end up with a very kind of similar problem, even though the target in some ways is very different. The one thing that I wanted to mention with words before I kind of just draw some conclusions about this is that I think that one of the big issues that comes out more with words than with groups, though it should come out with groups as well, is that people tend to, in these theories, they tend to be giving theories of what word types are. So the categories that word types are supposed to fall into. And they mention, as you can see from this list, they mention things like the tokens, like, well, they think that the things on the other side of the slash are like tokens. So they think that there are, David Kaplan argues that words are a kind of continuant and that tokens are stages of those continuants. There's a little bit of talk about tokens, but there's basically no discussion of how to classify tokens. That actually turns out to be as difficult a question as how to classify words. In some ways, tokens are structurally a lot more like particular groups. And so when you actually look at the options for the classification or desiderata for tokening, those end up looking more similar in some ways to the desiderata for groups. And so what ends up happening, I guess what my point is that you have a set of desiderata for one category for words, and a set of desiderata for word tokens, and then you also have a set of desiderata for the interactions between the two. And this is kind of what I was pointing out when I was saying that when people are working on classification, that there's not an appropriate recognition that we need to think about the fact that the nature of the target entities is going to hinge on answers to the nature of other kinds of target entities that are related to those entities. You cannot give, I think it's quite clear, an account of the nature of words without giving an account of the nature of word tokens. So you end up actually with a much larger set of desiderata, and you end up with a Ramsey sentence that looks a lot worse than the Ramsey sentence that I was proposing, because you end up having to have lots of different kinds of properties that end up realizing your complex set of desiderata for all of the different individuals and all of the different kind of subcategories and their relations to one another. Okay, so look, the point that I'm trying to make is I think that I'm kind of combining 2 points here. One of them is that the methodology that people are using, I think, needs a lot of work. I had said to you that I think that arguments and the approaches that people use in order to argue for the classification of one of our social ontological categories in a different category, that those strategies are not really thought through, and that some of the complexities that I'm bringing out here are things that have to be considered in order to do that work. But I also want to point out that I think that even if you do that, that the results are not necessarily informative. They're not necessarily more informative than trying in a kind of primary way to work out the features of the entities that are the targets in the first place. So I guess that both of these are grounds of skepticism. One is this methodological skepticism about, I don't see these methods as being applied kind of fully, rigorously, clearly. And the other is that even if we do come up with answers for these methods, even if we kind of get past the methodological and epistemic problems, it's not clear that we learned anything from them. Okay, and so I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Brian. Helpful, and yeah, it helps to understand and to give a general overview of the situation, which is a little bit doomed, but it's very helpful. So I think, yeah, I didn't see the order of the question, so it's still, I think Asa had the first question.
Cool. Yeah, thanks so much, Brian. That was really interesting. I just have a big picture question. So I'm wondering whether the sort of worries that you're raising are meant to apply specifically to social ontology, or whether you see them as applying more broadly to methodology, kind of in all of metaphysics, or maybe even all of philosophy. So at least if I think of some central debates in metaphysics, like the debate on material constitution, for example, it seems like a lot of the same points that you made would apply there, right? So people start with various desiderata for, understanding material things. Some of these are theoretical ones, like non-arbitrariness or parsimony. Others are, being in accord with our intuitions or considered judgments. And then people propose different theories of what ordinary material things are, which you would call categorizations, right? So some people say, well, they're four-dimensional worms. Other people say they're just matter. Other people say they're hylomorphic compounds. And so it seems like kind of everything you've said about the social ontology case of groups would kind of also apply here. So I'm just curious about your thoughts as to whether this is really kind of a distinctive worry or problem for the social ontology case, or whether you're just raising a more general problem for metaphysics or all of philosophy.
Thank you. I think you're right. I mean, I think that there's nothing particularly distinctive about the social case, except that it's clearer here in some ways where the problems arise. And so I think that this is partly one of the areas where kind of using cases in social ontology can help us bring out problems in metaphysics that might be obscured in metaphysics. I think that it's probably a tougher row to hoe in some ways to argue that ordinary material objects are should be understood as a kind of gerrymandered kind in some sense, and that it's not going to fit neatly into any of the ontological categories that people are proposing. Or in as much as it does fit into those categories, that those are just gerrymandered categories in a way. So I think you're right that I don't intend this to be restricted to the social case. I think that I mean, part of it is that there was another point I had kind of wanted to make, and I always feel a bit I bristle a lot at the literature where people use this term sui generis, So they're like, oh, well, it's not a set, and it's not a fusion, it's not a plurality, it's some other thing, so it's a sui generis kind. People talk about Usquiano's account of groups as, in his 2004 paper, as a sui generis kind. And I just don't understand why that invective is used, because it's not as though anyone is proposing that they're ungrounded. If that's what sui generis is supposed to be, then they're not sui generis. If it means that it doesn't fit into a familiar category, it seems fairly arbitrary that the categories we're familiar with are the familiar categories. And so so part of what I think is that when you're thinking about ordinary kinds of metaphysics, that this accusation is going to be even more intense. And so I think that this may be more of just like a useful argumentative strategy to worry about classification.
Right, thanks.
Asa, you had a question?
Yes, thank you, Brian. I find it very interesting, the sort of parallel between words and social groups that you draw. And when I was thinking, one thing is that I have a bit more like an intuitive understanding of what the word is, but when it comes to social group in general, I have no linguistic intuitions in the same sense. Like I have it for specific groups like the golf club or the tennis club or women or whatever, but not for social group per se. So one question is, how strong should we understand the parallel to be given that? And the second thing would be, is it possible to find desiderata for social groups in general, or wouldn't they be group specific in a sense? I could see that the golf club and the tennis club have coinciding members, but let's say that you have spies for two different countries, then they should not be coinciding at all, so to speak. Yeah, so the second question is, it might be possible to get desiderata for more specific social groups, but not for the general thing.
Yeah, I basically agree with all of that. I mean, to some extent, this paper is largely a critical paper. And so, I think that one of the things that I do think is useful is to point out the kind of wide variety of different social groups that there are. And in that sense, there are kinds of desiderata, but a lot of the desiderata I wrote are sort of, it's possible that blah, 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 which is sort of, it's sort of like an existential claim from an, intentional perspective. It's like, well, there is a possible group, or there's possibly a possible group that does, that does this sort of thing. And so that, I think, leaves it pretty wide open. That expands, in some sense, the set of things that groups might be. And it's not really, I think that it's not, those shouldn't be necessarily regarded as constraints, but saying, look, groups can come up in a variety of different forms. I think that you're right, though, that if you're going to try to characterize group kinds with some sort of more carefully circumscribed set of characteristics, that you're talking about group kinds, you're not talking about groups in general. I don't think there's actually that much to be said about groups in general. And that's part of why I find the literature on categorization to be extremely uninformative. I think that we need to, I don't know, I think it's a complicated story, because I think that there's some ways in which over time we end up innovating or expanding what groups can possibly be. So, like, to use my terminology, I think that we kind of re-anchor the category of groups successively as we come up with new ways of thinking about groups. I don't think that necessarily it used to be possible for there to be empty groups, in a sense, but then we re-anchored the category of groups so that we can have empty groups. And I think that you can see corporations and that sort of thing are also things that get anchored in interesting ways, where you end up expanding the possibilities. So it may be that you can circumscribe, that would suggest that you can circumscribe them as they're anchored at a particular point in time. But again, I think you're right, that this insight that if you really want to come up with some sort of clear set of desiderata for a set of groups, that it's much more likely that you need to do that for kind of a subkind.
Okay, yes, thank you.
Thomas, you had a question?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I think I'm pretty sympathetic, but just to stick up for the categorizers for the heck of it, I guess I tend to think of these sort of moves of saying, oh, groups are pluralities or whatever, as sort of theoretical identifications. And I guess if you think of them that way, then it feels like there are fairly natural things to say under the heading of what do you gain by this? I mean, not to suggest that they are necessarily correct things, but sort of natural suggestions do seem to bubble up. So if I, for instance, think that groups are fusions, well, then I know some stuff about fusions already, right? I know the principles of mereology, and now I've discovered that those apply to groups, right? So and there might be stuff in there that wasn't already on my list of desiderata, so I've learned something new about groups. That would be a good way for that to pan out. And you might also think there's the advantage of theoretical unification here, right? So there's a, let's say, take the fusions example. Everything that's a fusion behaves in a certain way metaphysically, and groups behave in all those same ways. Now, either this could just be grand coincidence, but if groups just are fusions, then it's not a coincidence, and I've achieved some measure of theoretical unification. So those seem to be like fairly natural things to say there. So it doesn't feel to me unobvious why one would want to do this.
Yeah. So I guess I think so this is a good point, and I guess I think that there are different kinds of classifications or categorizations that we see in the literature. And so I was going to actually title this paper kind of categorization, early stage and late stage. There's a sense in which, like in the early days, like when you're talking about say Quine, or there's a kind of reductive project that's being done, and I think that you're absolutely right that if that reductive project were to work, that there would be implications of that. I think that well, one issue is that many of the proposals on the table nowadays are nothing like that. They're more like they propose a broad category where they're not really doing a theoretical identification, but it's sort of like, it's more like horses are animals kinds of categorizations. So it's more like well, words are homeostatic property cluster kinds, but it doesn't say anything about what kind of homeostatic property cluster kind it is. I think that in the reductive projects, even in the reductive projects that were being done, there may be some of these things where you're like, well, it's one thing to say that groups are fusions, and it's another thing to say exactly what kind of fusion a group is, right? So if you're saying that groups are fusions of pluralities, and if what you're doing is you're identifying what a particular subcategory of a broader category as the thing that groups are, then you may be right that there are certain kinds of conclusions that can be drawn. But I guess I think that I don't know, I need a clearer answer to this, but I think that part of the answer is going to be that these projects are not particularly plausible. And part of those in particular are the least plausible among the candidates. Partly it's going to be that the ones that appear to be those kinds of claims are actually not really theoretical identification claims. And then part of it is going to be that a lot of them don't even appear to be that. And that may be more, and it may also vary from domain to domain. So I'm not quite sure. I don't think there's a simple answer to that question.
All right.
I definitely am sensitive to it. I think that I don't want to be too dismissive. And one of the worries I have is just that I'm like, well, these things suck, and they don't. There's some utility to them, but I think that, but I do really worry that once we've identified the clear utility that they have, that the categorization part of it will largely drop out.
Right. Right. Okay. Yep. Thanks.
So if there are not the questions, could say one more time bravo to Brian. It was very, very interesting, and thank you for the questions also. It was a very good discussion, and thank you all for today, and let's meet tomorrow then. Same time, same place. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.